Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first part of our board meeting. Just so everybody is clear on what we are doing an an IBB training at the moment, and this is going to be an open session. Then we will adjourn to closed session at 4 o'clock, and then we will come back to open session at 6 o'clock. All right, let's call to order the meeting at 2:04 p.m. Can we have roll call, please?
Yes, ma'am. Student Trustee Hogan. Student Trustee Cooper. Trustee Withrow.
Here.
Trustee Jenkins. Trustee Handy. Trustee Gonzalez Ewan.
Yes.
Trustee Bonilla. Trustee Delfin Polk.
Here.
Trustee Napoleon Reese.
Here.
You are all set. You have a quorum.
Great, thank you. And I believe I will hand this over now to either you, Chancellor, or Dr. McKinley.
Okay, as the board had requested, they wanted to get an update and training on the interest-based bargaining. And so it was asked if we wanted to go out or bring in a consultant or use some of our internal staff to provide that training. And so with that, we decided to go with some of our well-versed internal staff, both our Vice Chancellor of HR, Ron McKinley, and also Andrea X, who has recently been hired to the board, has a background, a legal background, and can also assist in providing this training. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to VC McKinley. And if you wanted to do any further introductions of Ms. Epps, you can do so, and then we'll get started. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So yes, we're going to do a tag team. So Andrea Epps is our new Director of Employee Relations and Diversity Programs. Very happy to have her here. She's doing a great job, hit the ground running fast, which is a very good thing. And we're going to, as I said, do a tag team. So I'd like to turn it over to Andrea and let her introduce herself, and then she will go through the first few slides. Then I'll be my turn, and we'll be going back and forth throughout the presentation. So Andrea, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Andrea X, the new Director of Employee Relations and Diversity Programs. It is a pleasure to meet everyone virtually and have the opportunity to present on interest-based bargaining. Sasha, will you be putting up the PowerPoint or shall I share?
I can do so. I can do so. 1 second.
Okay.
Guys, see that okay?
I can see that perfectly.
Wonderful.
As Dr. McKinley indicated, we're going to be presenting today on interest-based bargaining. Since we're headed to the tables with all three of our unions, it seems timely to have this presentation and to really make sure that the board has a deeper understanding of the process that will be used in those negotiations, and to also kind of look at interest-based bargaining as two components. You have first kind of the process. What does this look like when we're actually at the negotiation tables? Then you have the other part of it, which are what are some of the unique skills that we're going to need to be able to bring to the table because we are using an interest-based bargaining process versus more of a positional approach. I just thought that initially we could all introduce ourselves. As I said earlier, I am Andrea X. My length of service is a couple of months now. And during the negotiations, I will be at the table as part of the district negotiation team. I think that one of the things that gives me a unique perspective when I am at the table is as a former educator in Los Angeles Unified School District and Inglewood Unified School District, and then later as counsel for multiple K through 12 districts. I've had the opportunity of essentially having interest on both sides of the table. And I think that I'm very excited to kind of bring those unique perspectives to the tables here at Peralta. During this training, my hope is that everyone we'll actually kind of take away 6 things that we will cover on the next slide. But if we wanted to go around and quickly introduce other people so that everyone understands what everyone's role will be during our negotiations.
In no particular order, I'll start. Jeanette Jackson, usually individuals call me either Chancellor or Dr. J. I'm not partial to either one. As the interim chancellor, I will be overseeing the negotiations, but I will not be a part of the negotiation team that's sitting down at the table. What usually happens, and I anticipate it to be the same, if there are any issues that come up that require additional guidance from the board, I will be the one, in addition to VC McKinley, bringing that back to the board for either additional guidance or presenting some sides that we might want to take based upon feedback that we're getting from the bargaining units. And as Andrea indicated, we have all 3 bargaining units that will be at the table for the first time in many years. So it could get a bit complex, but that is my role. And what I hope to learn from the training is really an update if there's been any changes since I had this training, which has been a few years ago now. But that is, to me, the preferred method of bargaining is through an interest-based approach. So thank you, Andrea.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll go next. My name is Cindy Reese, and I am the president of the Board of Trustees. And nice to meet you, Andrea. We've heard a lot about you, and it's nice to virtually meet you. Life of service, this is I think I'm entering my 4th year, I believe. And I will not be playing a part either in the negotiation at the negotiation table. And what I hope to learn in this training is more about the process, because I believe that the more we know about the process, the more clarity we have, and hopefully the more effective the negotiations will be in the long run.
I guess I can start with zone number 1. Bill Withrow, a trustee. I'm in my 18th year on the board. I've been involved in many things throughout my various career patterns in interest-based bargaining, but including in about, I think, 2006 or 2007 with Peralta. The Chancellor asked me to sit in on some interest-based bargaining sessions, a number of them, and I found them to be quite good. There was an ongoing dialogue about the role and the mission and the issues and difficulties and challenges that went on, and the conversations and the things that were talked about were very meaningful. What I hope to learn from this training is how we do this with under the concept of the right to work law, interpretation by the courts of the right to work that seems to have changed the behavior of some of our union counterparts. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll jump in, I guess. I'm Nikki Gonzalez. Like Bill, I'm entering my 18th year on the board. I think, Cindy, you said you don't have a role at the negotiation table, and that's absolutely right. But I think we do have a role in negotiations, and that's setting policy direction and goals for for bargaining outcomes in a broad way. And I think that the perspective that I hope to bring to the process is a balanced role, having served on the board for 18 years, but also serving as a faculty member for over 30 years, serving on my union's executive council for almost half of that time, still being very active as a faculty leader bringing that perspective, like both of those perspectives, like we've got a win-win path, but oftentimes we don't choose that path. Oftentimes we choose not an interest-based bargaining path. And so what I'm hoping to get out of the training is to better understand what is the view of interest-based bargaining of the current administrative team and of the board. Like, how does that play out? Because oftentimes, you know, there's language that gets used about interest-based bargaining, but then there's so much positioning. And then it's like, well, wait, I thought we were doing this. And I'm not saying that with the current team, by the way. I haven't seen enough of the current team's actual bargaining to see that, but I'm hoping to better understand what is interest-based bargaining. What are the parameters of what we hope as a board and from the administration? What do we hope to get from it? If it worked out in the best possible scenario, what might we expect? And then where are we getting tripped up? Where are we seeming to have conflicts of interest that, in my mind, it's like, well, we all have an interest in dealing with this enrollment management issue, but we seem to approach it adversarially. How do we use this tool to undo that knot? Anyway, so I'll pause there. I'm really excited to be here and to see our board kind of doing this. And Bill, it was good to remind us that, in fact, you were at the table some while ago, that there was a period in bargaining in the state where that was much more common. I remember Cy had that position as well. So things have shifted. Anyway, all right, I'll move on. Thanks.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. My name is Dianna Delfin Polk. I am Vice President of the Board of Trustees. And I'm here to listen, excited to be here. I am a member of SEIU 1021 through my role with the Mayor's Office in Berkeley. And so I'm excited to learn more about this process and how I can be helpful moving forward. Thank you.
So I'll go next. Ron McKinley, Interim Vice Chancellor, Human Resources. And I'll be the lead negotiator around the table. And I'm in my second year now at Peralta. That's kind of hard to believe, but true. And I guess my kind of unique perspective is that that I've had over 30 years of experience as a chief HR officer in a number of industries, including higher education, which I'm in right now. So, and in an ancient past life, I was also a vice president of a union. So I've been on both sides of the table also, kind of understand what that is, although it's in the dim, distant past. And I think it's important every time you hear something, it helps you to develop a more complete perspective about a particular thing. And I think that's true also with interest-based bargaining. So the more I hear Andrea talk and questions and the interchange of ideas and perspectives, I think that will help me learn much more and maybe be better at this particular approach. And I think Royal and Stephanie Drerker are also here.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Royal Roberts. I'm the Special Assistant to the Chancellor, Chief of Staff. I am going to be for sure on one of the negotiation teams and maybe an additional one. This will be my third training going through the IBB interest-based bargaining, and I'm looking forward to the refresher. Thank you.
I guess I'm rounding us up. I'm Stephanie Drerker, and I'm the interim deputy chancellor. And I will not be at the table, but I will be supporting the chancellor in making sure that as she implements the policies of the board in this process, that I can support her and the rest of the leadership team. So thank you.
Thank you all. I think we're ready to move on to our next slide unless we've missed anyone.
Well, I'll just chime in. I'm in transit, but head back to campus. David Johnson, President of Merit. This will be my second training for the IBB. I was really, I couldn't agree more with Trustee Gonzalez UN in terms of how he articulated and encapsulated, I think, the goals that we needn't take an adversarial or acrimonious posture. And really, this approach will allow us, I think, to focus on the things that we can do to push the district forward, common goals, and being able to really focus and put accent and emphasis on those things that bring us together and help us meet the mark as a district. So thank you.
Thank you. So as I indicated earlier, we have 6 objectives during the course of this training. The first is to understand the importance of collaborative, empathetic, and effective communication. Secondly, we want to identify the fundamental differences between traditional positional bargaining versus the IBB process. Third, knowledge of the principles of IBB and how the process actually works. Fourth, learn discussion processes that surface underlying needs and interests. Fifth, techniques to generate creative options to solve tough problems. And last, that the key to success of this process really depends on developing an ongoing and positive relationship with labor and management relationships. You can go to the next slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are kind of 2 pieces to this. We're looking first at what are some of the underlying skills that are brought to the IBB process that make it separate and apart from the traditional positional negotiating. Then you have the other part, which is what is the actual process look like when we're at the table. The big part and skill set that we bring to the IBB process that's different is this perspective of opposing parties as our ally and not our adversary. We're also looking at creating collaborative agendas where we're including all parties' interests, needs, and values on our agenda, not just looking at what are the positional outcomes that each side wants. We're learning to balance advocacy with inquiry. When we're inquiring into what the other party's position is, that's how we really start to unpackage what are the underlying interests that are at play. Lastly, we want to be able to capitalize on the reciprocal nature of collaboration so that it's not one-sided. There's some give and take, and both parties are working collaboratively together to unpackage what are the interests that both parties have in this process, and how can we come up with win-win outcomes? Meaning that instead of looking at kind of the traditional method of we're trying to divide this pie, when we enter into kind of the collaborative and effective communication of IBB, we're looking to expand the pie. So there's actually more on the table as opposed to just this one thing, and we have to divide it in a way that is least combative for everyone. Next slide, please. So looking at the 2 different approaches to negotiations, we're going to be using IBB, where we're mutually agreeing to use a joint method of problem solving for certain issues in the attempt to maintain and build a relationship of trust, versus positional, where each party usually independently shows up with their proposals. And then we just negotiate and figure out how are we going to divide this pie that has been presented, instead of working collaboratively to figure out how do we really expand the pie. I think it's important to highlight that in positional bargaining, you're usually looking at it as if whatever one party wins on, the other side loses on. So it's very much if one party gets something, then the other party has given something up or they have lost something. Versus IBB, where you're looking at how can we expand what we have and where our interests align so that it's not that one side is giving something up so that the other side feels like they have a win. How can we all win? understanding that if we're looking at interest instead of just the position, that we have a better chance of getting there. Next slide, please. So we have our interest-based or our IBB approach versus our position-based approach. It's important to note that in an IBB model, we're all problem solvers working together. The goal is an effective agreement that's reached amicably. We're hard on the issues, but we're soft on people. So we're not personalizing things. It's really about kind of removing what tends to be the kind of personal attacks out of that process. We're also going to be focused on interest, not just someone's position. Not what do you want, but why do you want it? We all understand that they're mutually advantageous positions. It's not if one side wins, the other side loses. We're going to evaluate all options according to agreed upon criteria, meaning that we're going to co-construct those criteria and our process by which we can all agree this is something that we may want to come back to or want to agree on, or this is something that no one is interested in. But it's really about co-constructing throughout the process. We're going to be faithful to our interests, but flexible about the solutions that we come up with. And last, we're going to take the time to access and consult, meaning that typically IBB bargaining takes longer than more of a traditional, if you don't do X, we're going to walk type of position. But it's worth investing the time because you're really unpacking things that build the relationship and foster an agreement that there are fewer feelings of loss on both party sides. For position-based approach, you usually just view opposing parties as adversaries. They are not allies at all. The goal is for either party to walk away with what they identify as the positional win. You're hard on people and the problems, and a lot of energy is consumed just defending your position versus unpacking what is the interest that's underlying that. There's little discussion, and the position is on winning. Lastly, there's oftentimes kind of the application of pressure in terms of if I don't get X, then I'm going to walk. You don't see that in an IBB model. Next slide, please. So for those who have done IBB training before, there's kind of the typical hypothetical that everyone likes to use because it comes from the seminal book on how do we negotiate in this way. And so it's called the orange quarrel. And you have two children who both come in, run into the kitchen, and there's one orange left and they both want it. And so we're trying to figure out how can we create some type of fair resolution for both children. Next slide, please. So what are people's thoughts in terms of if we just divide the orange? Does that seem fair, equitable? Both kids get a half of an orange. So everyone should walk away happy in theory. No comments on if we divide the orange, is that fair? Is everyone going to be happy?
Sort of depends on whether people like orange and whether they need it.
How hungry are you? Have you just eaten, or did you have a full meal and you just want the orange because you just want it?
Or it's certainly equitable. The question is it fair? Why do they want the orange though?
So I think Dr. McKinley was kind of alluding to the fact that he knows the answer, and that we're looking at why did they want the orange? The assumption is made that they're hungry. What we find out in this hypo is that Joey wants the rind so that he can use it to make zest for cupcakes. Jenny wants to use it to make orange juice. So now that you understand what their interests are in the orange, is there another solution where both kids actually get a win? Joey can get the orange, the peel, and Jenny can still have her orange juice without us dividing the orange. And so that's interest-based bargaining. It's not just they both want the orange, so we're going to divide it, because then we're assuming that we know why they want it, and we don't. So when we're getting to the table and we're engaging in this process, we're really trying to figure out not the what, but the why. Why do you want the orange? Because we may be able to give Joey the whole peel without it impacting the amount of juice that Jenny has. And that's a win-win for everybody. So the whole goal of that is for us to kind of walk into IBB knowing that we're going to make assumptions when another party says, well, I want the orange. We're assuming they're hungry. No one is hungry in this hypothetical. Their interests are completely removed from the first thing that we're thinking generates their interest in this thing and in this position of I want the orange. So we're really trying to look at not only perspectives and why do we assume that when someone says I want this thing, that it's because they're hungry or for something that we don't necessarily know why they want it. But if we take the time to kind of engage in that process and communicate with them to unpackage that, we may be able to understand that their interest in it is different than our interest. And there's a way for both parties to have their interests met without having to divide the pie in a way that actually, while it's fair or equitable, doesn't really get to either of our underlying interests in having that thing. Next slide, please.
We could also candy the rind, sell the juice, buy about 5 more oranges. There's all sorts of solutions.
That's
there,
problem
right?
solving. Right. All righty. So, I think this is Dr. McKinley's slide.
Oops. Yeah, we do a transition here. So what's the starting point? And you can see there's a key up there. So how are options generated? We're going to talk about that. So, and then what are and we've already talked about the key distinctions between position-based and the IBB approach. And it's exactly that. It's not about us versus them, or it's not a zero-sum game. It's actually about trying to find a solution that's good for everyone, if at all possible, based on the interest that we have in that particular thing. And we'll also talk about how agreements are reached. And we're going to find out that communications are extremely important, much more important in this particular approach than in the next, or in the other approach, I should say. Next slide, please. All right, so the framework for interest-based bargaining, we're going to separate the people from the problem. The people aren't the problem. The problem is the issue that we're going to attack, and that's what we're going to be hard with, on the issues, not with people. And anyone that's been in the traditional position-based bargaining knows there's often some hard feelings between the parties at the table. There's a lot of past stuff that, baggage that people have that they bring with them, either real or imagined. So we need to try to avoid that and focus on the problem and not on people. So it's we need to be ruthless with the results and gracious with people would be another way of saying that. Focusing, of course, then on the interest, not the positions. We'll get to positions once we understand what the interests of the parties are. And then we need to work together to creatively invent, if you will, develop options that could actually result in mutual gain, rather than the historic zero-sum approach. And then we need to insist on being on objective criteria. We need to look at the facts. And feelings are important, but facts are are more important than feelings, if you will. So we need to get to what are the facts, what are those underlying data, so that we all understand those types of things the same way, or at least essentially the same way, so that we can get to a point that makes sense for everyone. Next slide, please. And this kind of makes it a little bit more visual. So we need to separate the people from the problem. So we also need to attend to emotions. Emotions are important, and we need to be able to read those emotions the best we can during the bargaining process. And that's only not what people say, but how they say it, their body language. It'll be a little bit more difficult on the body language part when we're going to be virtual. However, it's still possible. We need to understand folks' perceptions. Why do they feel the way they feel about things? Why do they have that particular point of view, and where are they coming from? Everyone's perception is different. And if anyone that's been through any psychological course in psychology, you understand that all of us have a perspective, and our perspectives are based on who we are and where we're from. So Dr. Morris Macy, and this is not part of this training, I'm going to add it. Dr. Morris Macy did a lot of research, if you will, on these particular things. And his premise was that we are where we were when we were 10 years of age. None of us picked our own parents. I've always joked if I had a chance to go to a used parent shop, I might have selected a different pair because I thought all my friends had really cool parents and I did not. At least that was my perspective. And I told my parents that. So it's not like I was hiding it from them. And but my point is, I was when I was 10 years of age, I was someplace very different than anyone else in this meeting right now. And everyone else was too. That's who we are. So we bring those perceptions. We need to try to understand where folks are coming from. And we need to communicate effectively. And we'll talk more about that later on. But a definition of effective communications is the transfer of knowledge from one person to another, or from one person to a group, or groups, where the other folks understand the message essentially the same way as the sender. So you send a message, and that means the receivers of the message then understand it essentially the same way as the sender. In other words, it's getting to understanding. So effective communication is about understanding the other person's perspective, their point of view, their interest, if you will, so we can move forward together based on the same premise. Next slide, or a shared premise.
I'm not sure I understand how you can separate the people from the process.
All right, so that's a very good question, and that's something I also thought about for a while myself. So the people are not the problem. The problem is the issue.
Right.
So we're going to focus on the problem, not the people themselves. So for instance, there could be folks on different sides of the table really don't like each other, or they've had some feelings have been bruised in the past. For instance, when there was some, if you will, positional based bargaining, and one side lost and the other side won. And so there are these kinds of feelings. So we got to try to get past the personal stuff, if you will, and focus on the problem itself. And then at the same time, though, taking into consideration the emotions of folks, and we've talked about that. So there are topics that might come up that would be quite emotional for some individuals around the table. We need to be able to recognize that, and you'll see a slide later on where if we need to, we can take breaks and give folks a chance to deal with that. Hopefully that answers your question, Trustee Withrow.
Well, I'm thinking, if I could just real quickly, where you've got individuals that are called upon to do things within the concept of achieving goals, and they don't have the accoutrements or the background or the expertise or the skill sets to do that, which puts them into an emotionally challenged kind of thing. And you can have that in a group, as a matter of fact, where there's a lot of downside to not doing something correctly, but they don't have the skill sets or background or whatever to achieve what they're called upon to do.
Well, you're exactly right, and we will experience a wide range of backgrounds and, if you will, experience and abilities and skills among the negotiating teams. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And we just lost the slides, and we now see the Chancellor's work group meeting.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. So, so you're exactly right. And that will be one of the challenges, but we'll have to we'll work through that. And, but that's true in every group setting. There's a wide range of perspectives, wide range of skill sets and experiences. So we'll have to deal with those. And then there are folks that will not have the technical expertise to address certain issues. And that will probably require more talking and talking in different ways. So saying it one way may not work, but saying it 2 or 3 different ways or having someone else say it can be helpful. All right, so we've already talked about this, I think, separating the folks, the people from the problem, and we need to focus on the problem, but we also need to pay attention to folks and how they feel going along. Next slide, please. So there are 2 major overall aspects, the process and the substance. So how we get to someplace and how we handle negotiations, that's the process, and the substance or the final would be the final outcomes. And they both have to make sense. And well, I should put it this way, the outcome has to make sense regardless of the folks that are involved. And so if you think about relationships and people, they are part of the process. So we have to make a commitment to disentangle, if you will, any relational personal issues from the final results. Now, I should mention that we're going to be using interest-based bargaining with the PFT, the faculty union. We do not, and that is a requirement in their contract. We will not be doing it with the other 2 unions. We'll be using traditional position-based bargaining with those 2 unions, SEIU 1021 and Local 39. So I'd just like to point that out. Next slide, please. So we need to remember not to make it personal and to realize that every problem comes with, there's a historical context. So we know that the folks, for instance, in the PFT, they've all been part of their bargaining unit for 10 years or more. They know each other very well. They are rehearsed, if you will, and practiced. And that's not true for the if you will, the district's team. And in other words, we've not been cohesively together as a group for nearly that long. Trustee Gonzalez, Ewan, do you have a question?
Is there a particular reason why we are not using this process with Local 39 and SEIU? If in fact we think that it works well with the faculty, and we typically have them as our lead, like oftentimes stuff that gets settled with the PFT then rolls in a sort of a Me Too fashion. Why aren't we taking that approach with the other 2 unions?
They don't. They have said that they would prefer to have this traditional bargaining approach.
And is it our position as well that we're not interested in an interest-based bargaining, or we've simply deferred and they've said, well, we're not interested in negotiating that, and so we're not going to put it on the table?
So to answer that question, both parties have to want to use interest-based bargaining to make it work. All the parties have to have attended training to make it work and believe that that's the approach they want to use. And the other 2 unions do not use this approach at all. They do traditional position-based bargaining.
I'm suggesting that if in fact it is something we believe adds value, it is something we could put onto the table to negotiate. And if we got to agreement, then it might add uniformity to the process.
You're correct. That is something
when we're all done, and then when we have closed session discussion about what the board's position is, we can raise that if it's the will of the board as a policy matter. If we think, yeah, this works really well, then I guess we can follow up on that. But so thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, we certainly can do that. Thank you very much. So, and I think we've I think I've covered this already. So we want to be sure that we understand at least and are sensitive to any historical context that involves people. Next slide, please. And I believe this is where I turn it over to Andrea.
That's right. So as we previously indicated, there's two parts. There's the actual process, and then there's some of the skills that we're going to have to bring into the process. One of the skills is understanding perceptions. As we saw with the example regarding the orange, some people assumed that the children must be hungry. They want to eat the orange. That's based on our own perceptions of why would you want one. So we need to understand that we're all limited by our perspectives, and sometimes other people's perspectives do not mirror our own. And we want to start to unearth that and understand the impact that that has on people's interests as well as their positions. So it's just important that we highlight that, the process of perceiving things is highly personal. And when you're engaging in a joint problem-solving process, you're going to have to understand that other people's perspectives do not necessarily mirror your own. Next slide, please. So we're going to be exploring the impact that perceptions have on individual team members as we enter into the IBB process, because perceptions can impact our participation, our position, and just generally how we view things. So in terms of exploring perceptions, we're not going to assume that our own perspective is the truth. We're going to share where our views come from. We're going to be empathetic and understand how to put ourselves in other people's shoes. Definitely ask clarifying questions so that we understand where other people are coming from. We're not going to infer intent. And we're going to ask our counterparts how they see things differently and why. So really engaging in that communication of understanding their interests and why that is the result of the position that has been presented to us in terms of what they would consider to be a win. Next slide, please. So in the book, Difficult Conversations, I think one of my favorite quotes from that book is, the point is this: difficult conversations are almost never about getting the facts right. They are about conflicting perceptions, interpretations, and values. And so it's important that we understand that as we're entering into negotiations, because what our unions say they may want, it may be a difference in perspective, which doesn't mean that we can't figure out kind of how to resolve it in a way that's satisfactory to both sides. It just means that we need to have an understanding about their perceptions, because it's that underlying conflict and perceptions that can cause problems in this process. Next slide, please. So in terms of the different skills that we're developing, we're understanding how to take other people's perspectives. That's one of those skill sets that we're going to be bringing into this process. We're also going to have to work on very effective communication. It's important that we use active listening, that we kind of shift our internal stance from I understand something to help me understand it. We're not going to assume that we understand it. It's always important to ask those clarifying questions, because my perception may lead me to believe that it's something that it's not for this other person. So we're really looking at how we can move the conversation forward. And in order to do that, we have to understand that the other party has to feel heard. They have to feel understood. And so instead of assuming that we know what they're saying and why they're saying it, we really need to unearth the why. Next slide, please. Some of the ways that we're going to help with the effective communication is we're going to co-construct what our communication norms are throughout this process. So meaningful ground rules are important to a successful negotiation. That ensures that everyone is entering the negotiation knowing what is going to be acceptable and what is not. I'm always thinking about it now that we're kind of in this very different virtual setting that, yes, we're used to at this point. There's still certain things that people may interpret or infer are disrespectful that other people do not believe to be such. So just having open communication about what are those ground rules. The ground rules can be developed in a separate meeting, but need to be developed with sufficient time prior to the beginning of the discussions so that both parties can agree to those norms. It's also important to kind of set up the framework of trust and effective communication. And so some of the ground rules, sorry, next slide, please, that I have seen include, just being very clear about what the expectation is in terms of confidentiality, being very clear about when we will take breaks, what signs will we be able to give to each other if someone needs a break for something that we didn't consider. Maybe someone is emotionally overwrought or just wants to take an opportunity to go caucus with their team, but doing it in a way where it's not perceived to be disrespectful. So some ground rules that are very common, one's about respect. So no sidebar conversations at the table. If one person is speaking, then someone else can keep track of who, asked to speak next. Again, we're going to focus on the issue, not on the person. We're going to ask for questions to promote understanding and clarity, but do that in a way that's respectful. So, don't interrupt people while they're speaking. If you have a question that you want to ask, write it down and raise your hand. Engaging in respectful and courteous behavior. Minimize distraction of electronic devices. I think that's probably one of the hardest ones in our newfound reality. And I think for a lot of people, something as simple as, if you're texting while they're talking, they may infer that means that you're not listening. So just being clear on some of the things that other people may infer from activities or behaviors that, we find acceptable. Also, we're going to acknowledge everyone's perspective, and we're going to acknowledge the emotions behind those, which I think is probably one of the more difficult skill sets for a lot of people in terms of when we're in a professional setting. We're not supposed to be addressing emotions in that space. And so that's one of those skill sets that I think sometimes people struggle with in this context. Additionally, another norm, how do we promote trust? We're going to share openly. No one is to blame. We're going to engage in active listening. We're going to come to meetings with an open mind. We're going to act in good faith, and we're going to expect positive intentions. I will say that in terms of like acting in good faith, sometimes I've seen more detail in terms of what does that look like? I think it's probably a phrase that people assume that they know what the other party means when they say you're going to act in good faith. So sometimes you can even come up with communication norms that drill down on what does that look like in practice for this team. Next slide, please. Like I said, big one, confidentiality. The team gets to decide what information is confidential and what will be conveyed publicly. The team will decide how information will be shared with its constituents. Information will be shared, but particular conversations will not. And parties will also give each other a copy of any written communications in advance prior to distribution. Another communication norm, just staying on task. As you'll see when we kind of go through what the process looks like, we co-construct the agenda. And so staying true to what's written on the agenda and not bringing in things that are outside of the scope of that is a norm. Acknowledging the historical context, as Dr. McKinley said, but we're going to focus on the solution. So on the district side, we are newer to the team versus a lot of the union side have been with Peralta for a very long time. So we're going to have to acknowledge the historical context. And maybe this is the better part, is that because some of us are new, we would not even have the ability to rebut whether the accounts are accurate. So instead of getting into that and unpacking whether or not there are even disputes about the historical context, we can accept it as it is and then focus on what our solution is moving forward. Start and end on time. That tends to be another very tricky one, but we do our best. Be prepared, complete tasks by the agreed upon deadline. We also need to have kind of those respectful carve outs of there are going to be some issues that we have to table. You know, maybe it's not a good time, or maybe we're not fully prepared to unpackage those issues at this time. So we have to have some type of signal or agreement that when a party says, you know, we're not here to discuss that today, that's accepted and no one feels slighted. Let's hear, all members are empowered to enforce the ground rules. Draft of meeting minutes will be approved at the beginning of each meeting, and a tentative agenda will be prepared at the close of each meeting. So these are some, and they're not static. You know, the team is always encouraged to kind of figure out what things are important to them. And I'm sorry, I see a hand raised.
Thanks, Andrea. Just a question about the confidentiality, bullet points 2, 3, and 4. So as you talk about the team deciding the information and how the information will be shared, does that mean that only that information should be shared to each of the constituent bodies, and therefore no other information from the conversations from the table could be shared with the different constituent bodies? So there's only one piece of information and the team must decide on that, and no other side information, no other information can be shared that has not been approved by the team at the table. Is that how I'm understanding those 3 bullet points?
Yes, and let me ask you one question. So when you say the constituent bodies, are you meaning like what is said in negotiations in terms of what we can bring back to share with the board, or what will be publicly disseminated to the public, to the community, and to union members?
Yeah.
I would say both, right? So let's say you've got a member or representative from a union, what they share with their individuals needs to be decided by the team in the same manner that what is shared with the board needs to also be decided by the team. Or could the information that you share with the union members or the board be whatever it is? I don't know if I actually confused your question more so, or if I clarified it.
I think I got it. So, for example, the district team, we will not have to have an agreement in terms of what we are going back to share verbatim with our board. Because, and okay. So similarly with like the union side, in terms of their top decision makers and their attorneys, that information is separate and apart. The public communications, what can be represented in terms of these are confidential negotiations, and we can go and tell every member or, you know, members of the community about, those are the things that we will agree upon. But what the district team can come back and discuss with the board in closed session, that is closed session. That is separate and apart.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Next slide, please. Another very common thing that we like to kind of have flesh out before we enter the process, caucuses. So, you know, in addition to, of course, they're allowed, so everyone has the right to go and speak privately with just their team about where things are headed, how do we want to respond to certain things. We try to keep them brief. That is not always an option, depending on what we're discussing. But we do try to be respectful of everyone's time. Another, I think, important part of caucuses, especially kind of in the Zoom world, is before you actually enter into the caucus, already have it vetted in terms of, are we just doing breakout rooms? Are there certain people who are going to leave the joint session and then go into their own Zoom call, so that then we're not spending time trying to kind of figure out the logistics of who's going where. So I think that that's also kind of an additional piece in terms of communication norms that we would be looking to include when we enter this process. Like, what does that look like? Who do we communicate with when the caucus is done and we're ready to come back into joint session? And I think another thing that I'm kind of seeing now that we've been in the Zoom world, also kind of this notion of communication norms and people being like meaningfully present and visible, versus so, and it depends on the team. Some teams are like, if you're here, we want to see your monitor on, we want to see you engaged, or, if your screen's off, can you make sure that you indicate in the chat that you're still there? So things like that, so that everyone knows kind of what to expect and what our kind of community norms are around what our expectations are. Last thing is, as you'll see when we break down the actual process for getting to an agreement, that you have this consensus decision making where everyone is involved, everyone has an equal voice, we all have the ability to revisit the issues, and if you cannot come to a consensus on an issue, then you're responsible for speaking up about what the concern is that prevents you from being in agreement. Again, just kind of fostering clear and open communication about what is the underlying issue. Don't lead people to assume that they know why you weren't in agreement. Speak up and convey what that issue was. Next slide, please. And so I'm sure that everyone can tell by now, a big part of this is just working on our communication skills, because it is so different from kind of the positional type of approach where kind of here's the list of the things that we want, take it or leave it, and we'll hear back from you. And, maybe we'll kind of haggle back and forth. So we're really focusing on having those really good communication skills, and some tips that may seem obvious to some, but not to all of us. Just listen and ask questions. Talk to promote understanding, and to have a positive interaction. Describe how the problem impacts you. Speak in the first person. Share your thoughts, your observations, and your fears. Do not make assumptions about other people or their intentions. And then ask other people for their point of view, as that's really how we kind of start to get at understanding the underlying interests that are involved. Some of the techniques that sometimes work in terms of really improving that communication is checking for understanding, or going back and paraphrasing what someone said so that you can see if you actually understood it in the way that they conveyed it. Another communication skill that is often used in IBB is reframing the issue. That way you can make sure that you're understanding it correctly. Next slide, please. So we're going into this process understanding what are some of the barriers to effective communication. We assume, and then there's no need to talk. So that goes back to one of the things that we highlighted earlier in terms of if someone says something and you assume that you know why they said it, versus understanding that there may be a reason that you aren't aware of based on your limited perspective. So when we don't assume, then we can kind of really start to have those conversations. Oftentimes we communicate in one direction. We tell people. And so we're looking more at how can we ask open-ended questions that really give people an opportunity to give us more than one-word answers. Also, we want to make sure that we're not sending mixed messages. And a good way to do that is to clarify, to rephrase. 3 ways to strengthen communication in relationships. We want to consult before deciding. Common theme throughout this presentation, listen actively. And plan to be clear, be rational, be purposeful, and not be impulsive. Next slide, please.
All right, so this gets my turn now. So here are some things to consider. In other words, these are things that we're asking the question, do you think these things are being productive? And the quick answer to that would be probably no, none of these. So these are the kind of things we'd like to avoid. So for instance, we've already gone over why that won't work, yet you bring it to the table every time we negotiate. And so that's something that is designed to actually put other people back on their heels, which is not something you want to do in an interest-based bargaining. It says we haven't given any reason to consider that proposal seriously. This is the same kind of thing. So, and I'm not going to read all of these, but they are all essentially negative statements, if you will, or negative approaches towards the other party that puts the other party at dis-ease, something less than being at ease. So for instance, that would be a good idea, except it will never work. And there's another key here too, that in interest-based bargaining, you want to try to avoid what I'm going to call the using the word but. Well, I think that's a great idea, but, because as soon as you say the word but, or however, or, you know, therefore, one of those linking words, that really means it negates your previous part of the statement. No, it means that really is not really a good idea. And without explaining why you might feel that way. So, and so for instance, do you have any other ideas? Obviously that means the ones you have are no good. So the point is to avoid these kinds of counterproductive statements and approaches to reaching consensus. And consensus, by the way, I'm just going to say that really quickly, and that's what we're looking for, a consensus. And that's something that everyone is comfortable with. It's not necessarily everything everybody wants, and it's not even necessarily compromising. It's reaching a point and say, this is the best solution we can get to at this moment. So, and you certainly don't want to say number 10 there, the craziest idea you've given us yet, even though it might be. There are no crazy ideas when you're doing brainstorming and looking for shared problem solving, that all ideas are good until we agree that we're going to pick a better one, or pick the one that we like best, the best one of all of the crazy ideas that we've heard, if you will. Next slide, please. So, and here are some key active listening things. Now, this is, I like to point out, I don't know how many of you, but I never, in my formal education, and a bunch of different schools, right, and college, universities and what have you, there was never a course on how to be a good listener. There were communication courses, right? And communications, you know, speech, for instance, how to give a good speech and all that kind of stuff, how to use good, you know, the proper words at the right time, but not necessarily how to be a good listener. So to be a good listener, you have to be attentive. We actually have to pay attention to other people when they are talking without forming our rebuttals. Because as human beings, that's what we do. While someone's talking, especially if they are in an adversarial kind of a position, we are already formulating subconsciously our rebuttals to their point of view if they don't agree with them in the first place. So we need to be attentive. We need to ask open-ended questions, not just something to be answered with yes or no. So tell me why you feel the way you do. Don't tell me how you feel. Oh, I feel bad or I feel good. Tell me why you feel the way you do. That's an open-ended question. We can then get to understanding. And we need to ask probing questions. If we don't really understand what the other persons have said, we need to ask more probing questions. Well, you told me that you feel this way because in your past life, it's never worked well for you. Why hasn't it worked well for you? Explain, you know, what prevented it from working well for you. So that we do probing questions to get deeper into the underlying issues there and request clarification. We all choose words that we're comfortable with. They may or may not be the words that others are comfortable with or mean the same thing to them. They may have different perspective on what the meaning of those words are. So we need to try to get clarification so we really understand what the other person is saying, not what I think they're saying, but what they're actually saying. We do that also by paraphrasing. I mean, I understood you to say X instead of Y. And then we also need to be attuned to and reflect on other person's feelings. Now, that's hard to do if you're somebody like me, because you're not going to see my feelings very much. But at least if you see me smiling less than normal, that might be some indication that I'm not very happy. You see what I'm getting at? So we need to try to be attuned to that and be aware of it. And then we need to summarize things so that all of us at the end of the day, we're all on the same page and we all understand the issue the same way. And we walk away from there with that shared perspective, if you will. Next slide, please. So once again, attend to motions. And so we need to pay attention to the frowns, to the smiles, and those kinds of things. Or if we can see folks that their eyes are rolling, or they seem to be disinterested, or they are frowning or doing other kinds of things that might cause us to may want to focus on those emotions more. Next slide, please. So how do we manage these things in negotiations? Well, we do this first of all by being respectful. I'd also like to mention one of the ground rules that we need to have is we don't interrupt others. Everyone gets to speak their piece, and so that we don't, cut them off in mid-sentence and bring up another point. So being respectful with and acknowledging other person's emotions about an issue. We need to be willing to take breaks if necessary to give folks a chance to deal with that, because some issues may be quite emotional for some individuals. And as we all know, some folks are more emotive than others. Some people wear their emotions on their sleeves. We need to be aware of that and give them a chance to deal with those things in an effective way. We need to ask questions and then wait for the answers. And that means be quiet. And that's uncomfortable for Americans, because as soon as there's quiet, we think we have to fill it with noise. No, if we ask a question, give folks a chance to answer the question. Don't answer it for them. And then if you are one of the other, if you're the one with the emotional response, you need to take responsibility for it. I'm accountable for my emotions. No one else is. So I need to take accountability for it, the way I feel about things, and be able to explain that to others so that they understand it. Trustee Withrow, you have a question?
Who did you just call on?
You, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't hear it. In all of these issues, and they all make sense, they really do, in terms of addressing just an awful lot of things, but it would seem to me that within the context of an issue, that the first thing you'd want to do is get a common understanding of the definition of whatever that issue is. And then to the extent that when you're looking at various solutions, you're looking at and recognizing it in a common understanding of collateral damage, because something may be great to solve an issue, number A, but B, C, and D get hammered along the way. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. There are always unintended consequences of anything. Anytime you take any kind of an action, there's going to be some type of reaction. It may be positive or negative or neutral, but there's always going to be, and there's always the opportunity to have some unintended consequence that no one has thought of. But I think you need to be willing and able to deal with those when they surface.
And it would seem to me you'd want them on the surface.
You want them on the surface. That's right. You want to be aware of it. So if there's something there, you need to speak up, right? If there's something bothering you, that's the other thing. Please say it, and we're all going to be responsible around the table to bring those up. If there's something bothering me, I need to voice what it is, hopefully in a calm, respectful, in my view, a dispassionate way, so that others can have a chance to understand that and to weigh in on it.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. So, next slide, please. We're making another transition here. So, oh no, I still get this one. All right. So how do we manage these emotions? Well, I think we need to be respectful and acknowledge that emotions are an issue, and we need to, or the emotions about the issue, I should say. We need to be willing. I think we've already said this. I think we've done this slide already. So next slide, please.
That is me.
That is you, yes.
So we have spent time discussing some of the kind of specialized skills that we'll be using in the IBB process. Perspective taking, active listening, listening for understanding, attending to emotions. Now we're getting into what does the actual process look like. So the IBB process includes establishing the ground rules, which we discussed earlier in terms of like what are our communication norms, what are our expectations in terms of procedurally if we're going into a caucus. So the process can be very narrow or very broad, and that's up to the parties to agree on, because again, we're co-constructing to kind of create parameters in which we all can be successful. So we can look at, what will the location be when everyone, actually did this in person without masks back in the old days, what were going to be the sitting arrangements, ground rules, what will be the flow, kind of the timing of expectations. Next slide, please. So here is a sample process. Co-construct the agendas, place an item on the agenda, describe the situation, create an issue statement, generate interest, share interest, check for joint interest. Then you're going to identify some of the options that are generated with no judgment, have a discussion and clarify the options. And then ultimately, what does it look like for your consensus process? Once you reach a consensus, how will that language be drafted into the contract? And then you'll see at the bottom, there's also, you can kind of just have a key that you use in terms of if it's a thumbs up for consensus and how you want to communicate that. But it all starts with kind of the initial process. I think we discussed earlier where you're coming up with your agenda, you're going to identify your communication norms so that going into the first meeting, you actually have kind of a framework for what will be discussed, how will people be able to communicate when they have concerns, and what will the process look like? Yes, Trustee Withrow.
Just a basic question here. At what point in time do you, in the interest-based bargaining discussion, determine how important the items are that you're talking about to both sides? At what point in time?
I think after you've set your agenda, you know what things you're discussing, going through to identify what are the underlying interests. That's usually when that information comes out. And it's very different than kind of the traditional positional bargaining where you have, here are our 7 things. And then, that side knows which of the 7 they really, really want, but they're never going to tell the other side because you're like, for each one, I'm using this as leverage. So the IBB process doesn't necessarily have that, here's 7, and we're willing to lose these 3 because we're more so operating under the premise that any issue that we're putting on the agenda is important. And what is the underlying interest associated with that? And there may be a way where we don't have to take away from your 7 in order for us to have an agreement that we all think works for us. So that isn't necessarily as easily described in the IBB process as just kind of the strict positional, I have 7, but I really only have 3 that I have to have, and I'm not telling anyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And that's a nice, actually kind of segue to our next slide, involving our best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So one of the things about entering the IBB process is everyone is entering under the assumption that everything that they would agree to would be, the floor is their best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So for example, most of the time when companies already have a collective bargaining agreement and they're like, that is our floor for what we would get because that's the status quo. That's what's already in there. Even if it's expired, there's still some things that, are operational. So you're entering in to the IBB process under the auspices of this is my floor. And so having that kind of as your perspective really lends itself to kind of better evaluating when you're willing to say that's an absolute deal breaker for me. And so essentially like the best alternative to negotiation is this is what, if we have no deal, what are we left with? And so each party is supposed to kind of keep that in the forefront when you're thinking about, well, I don't like what they said, so I'm done here. Well, what happens if we don't have a deal? And so it refers to the most advantageous alternative course of action if the negotiations fail. So I think that instead of like positional bargaining, where you are walking in and you have your list of 7 and you're like, these are the 3 that we absolutely have to have, but we have those other 4 so that it looks like we want more. And then the other party's thinking that they're getting a deal when we just walk out with these 3. You're looking at the perspective of it much differently in terms of here's what we already have. And, you know, since we already have existing collective bargaining agreements, like this is our floor, and whatever was in there, we've already kind of lived with, but we can make things better. Next slide, please. So this is kind of our 7-point process for what IBB looks like. We can go on to the next slide so we can discuss framing the issue. And I'll ask you, this probably circles back, Trustee Withrow, to the question that you were asking earlier about also separating the people from the problem. When you're using the IBB framework, the issues are co-constructed, and then you're looking at what is the underlying interest. And so the interest of something versus just looking at the issue that someone may feel impassioned about, being a part of a team where then we're kind of digging into, we understand that issue, but like, what is that underlying interest? That can sometimes provide people with the distance that they need to see kind of here's the interest, which is usually separate and apart from that individual. So kind of the framing of the issue process is really important throughout the IBB process, and then using that to dig deeper into what are our underlying issues that are coming out of our discussion about that. So our objectives here in framing the issue are to identify and develop a joint understanding of the issue. We're going to create a problem question that both sides agree to be guided by in terms of what are we attempting to solve. We're also going to, as it says, like this helps to disentangle relationships and people from the problem itself. Next slide, please. So in order to frame the issue, we're going to look at a couple of things. What is the current state? Why is it a problem? What needs to be addressed? When I think about how to frame an issue, I also think about how things are presented. And so you want to make sure that you're presenting it from a positive perspective. That implies that like resolution is possible. As I think there have been studies that show that people are more willing to kind of buy into the process. And so one example is, you know, if you're at a store and you're buying yogurt and one says 90% fat free, and then the one next to it looks the exact same, but it says 10% fat. So they're actually the same, but people are going to lean towards the one that says 90% fat free because that sounds healthier than 10% fat. So when we're framing the issue, you want to go with the 90% fat free over the 10% fat, if that makes sense in terms of an example. Next slide, please. So how do we frame an issue? We're going to make notes of data and interests that emerge during storytelling. You'll address these thoroughly later. We're going to form a problem question. This is a joint process. Then we're going to get consensus on the problem question before we move forward. So it's really about co-constructing. How do we see the issue in a way that doesn't come across as bias or implying, you know, negativity on the part of one side or the other. I think of it in terms of like that orange hypothetical with the two kids. How would we be able to form an issue or frame an issue so that it helps us figure out how to get at those underlying interests that both of the kids had in the orange? And so maybe instead of framing it, how do we divide the orange? because that implies that we're going to divide it. When, as we learned through that hypo, we didn't need to divide the orange for everyone to get what they need. So just being sensitive to how we frame an issue in terms of it can imply that we already have a solution in our mind that isn't necessarily going to be a win-win. Next slide, please. So informing the problem question, it will be open-ended because as we discussed earlier in terms of communication, that open-ended question will lend itself to us getting more information about the underlying interest. It has to be neutral free, to not be leading, as I indicated in the problem question with the orange. If we say, how will we divide the orange, it is not a free of solutions question. We're implying that we know how we're going to solve it. It's focused, right size for the discussion, easily understood, and if necessary, it may be expressed in multiple questions. But again, those questions are going to be co-constructed with both parties. Next slide, please. I think that's you, Dr. McKinley.
You're on mute, Dr. McKinley.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So I could hear myself talking, so that was kind of scary. So anyway, facts are important and should be known by all the parties. And so facts should not be hidden. Data should be relatively easily available and readily available for everyone. Everyone has a right to information. So we have an obligation, for instance, to give information to the unions when they ask for it, and the other, that works both ways. It's a two-way street, not a one-way street. Unknown facts are essential to the problem that need to be known. So if there are facts that others don't know that would help to address the problem and reach a solution, we need to make sure or ensure that those things come to the surface and that folks become aware of them. And so facts that are known by one party are eventually going to be known by the other one. So anyway, so we need to go ahead and share those things right up front and not try to hide anything. So this is quite different than what Andrea has talked about, the three things that we really want, we're not going to tell you about until we get them. And if we don't get them, we're going to walk away. We're going to take our football and go home. We're not going to play the game anymore. So then facts then will assist the parties in actually evaluating whether or not things are acceptable or fair, and whether they are used based on objective criteria. And then we need to share. We've already talked about that. Data collection and sharing is ongoing. It's not just a one-time event. Next slide, please. So identifying interest, we need to focus then on developing interests that expand the universe of available solutions. There may be solutions that no one at the table has thought about at all until we start exploring these things together. So all of us have a right to exist and maintain our legitimate interest. We all have a right to enhance our relationships, and we should be enhancing our relationships, not working at odds, but working together. Actually, we are part of the same team. We can't exist without each other in a collective bargaining environment. Both parties are absolutely essential and play equally important roles. So there's mutual gain then possible if we do this in a good way and make and develop durable outcomes. And we need to fully share disclosure of information and be helpful that's helpful in terms of expanding the dialogue, and a dialogue is what we're looking for. And then it's much better to reach agreements through reliance on rational criteria than it is upon demonstrations of power. Well, we're going to do it this way because we're the 500-pound gorilla in the room, and we have a lot more power you do. No, we need to base it on rational criteria and, if you will, sell the case that here's the reason why this is a good solution, and that we can all come to an agreement around. Next slide, please. I can't see the slide numbers. Can you see those, Andrea? So
39.
39.
Mhm.
All right. So then interest, not positions. As we've already said, positions are concrete results that we want. However, interests are the intangible motivations that lead us to a position. And they're the underlying hopes and concerns and needs. And these are the things that need to be addressed in interest-based bargaining. And then it's very possible that we have some shared values that we have not talked about before because we never had the opportunity to articulate those things. So getting to those interests, we're much better, or I should say more likely to have these shared values than not. Next slide, please. So here's a position, must have work hours between 8:30 and 3. That would be nice. I don't remember having work hours between 8:30 and 3, but if I did, that might be nice. So, but here are your interests then. What are the interests? Well, the reason for that is that I have concerns about my children being home after school alone, right? And that's why I need to be home at 3. There's the underlying interest. Or I want a greater overlap with my supervisor. I want to be able to be there when my supervisor is there, and that's when that person works. And then so you can see the interest, homework support, safety, and then project support. So that's the idea, is to get to those underlying interests that lead us to a position that we both find palatable, or that everyone finds palatable. The next slide, please. So shared or compatible interests lie beneath, and here's the key. This is your iceberg, and positions are the tip or the top of the iceberg. And as we all know, that 90% of the iceberg is under the water. So those are the interests, the things that drive that, and they are invisible. They are intangibles, and we must tease them out, if you will, or as Andrea said, unpack them, because they're there. We just need to find out what they are. Next, please. Next slide. Then going along with this, we need to remain calm and dig deep. So why do you want that? Why is this important to you? What concerns, fears do you have? What do you hope to accomplish? How would that help you? These are the kinds of questions we need to ask and get to so that we can then, once again, tease out these interests and come to some agreement on them. Next slide, please. And do you see the slide number here? I can't see it.
43.
43. All right, so here are some interest step pointers. So we need to realize each side has multiple interests, and that's absolutely true. We need to make our interests come alive. We need to be very specific about them, and need to be concrete details, not only to make descriptions credible, but that they'll add then impact, so that that's impactful on everyone at the table. And then we need to be strong advocates for our interests. That's absolutely okay, but it's not okay doing it at the expense of other people. So Ron, once again, ruthless with the interests, but gracious with people. And this is where we should place our aggressive energies, on being advocates for the interest and what those things mean. Next slide, please. And then we need to acknowledge the other party's interest and that they are part of the equation, and that they are at least equally important as ours. And successful negotiation requires both being firm and open. So we need to be firm, but we also need to be open, and we need to explore some other interests if that's where it leads us, if that's where our discussions lead us to. The next slide, please. I think this is yours.
And that's
now.
me. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the process, after we have gotten an understanding of the party's interests, then we can generate options. So the way that I think about this is in terms of like the orange coral. We started generating options before I announced what the interests were. And so then we ended up with solutions that were not responsive to the underlying interest. So in an IBB process, after you've gotten through identifying the underlying interest, Then you start the process of generating options. And so how are we going to do that? Next slide, please. We're going to brainstorm. And so that really means looking again at like co-constructing this with all of the parties. We're going to be writing down any ideas that come up in terms of what are the options for managing not just the issue, but the underlying interest that came out of the previous part of the process. Next slide, please. So in order to generate options, we're going to ask for a range of ideas. We're going to start with general concepts before we get into specifics. We're not going to evaluate what some of the options are that are offered. And they're just offers or proposals. It does not mean that we're going to kind of run with them. It's just part of getting things out that may be something that could work. Again, I think earlier I said that, you know, one of the big differences between traditional positional bargaining, where we have to divide the pie, and any slice that one party takes away from what's available for the other party. When you're in the IBB model, you're looking at expanding the pie. And so this is where we start to really look at how can we expand it in ways that are meaningful. Next slide, please. So once we have gone through the process of identifying our interests, we now have a lot of options hopefully up on the board in terms of what are some of the things that we can do to potentially address these underlying issues. Then we have to evaluate our options. And this is where, as a team, we're looking at what will and won't work. This is also usually about the time where people who have a different perspective and can say, going with this option will solve this problem, but by the way, it's going to actually create this other issue. So maybe then when you're looking at whether or not you want to use this as one of your options, you're taking into consideration that it's going to cause some type of resulting, you know, consequence in another department or another part of the budget, or kind of whatever was identified in terms of here's another consequence that you wouldn't know it unless you held this work. So that's one of the great things about kind of being in like a brainstorming model with so many people, that everyone has a different perspective. And sometimes the work that they've actually been holding lends itself to highlighting, you know, other consequences of some of the options. So we're going to go ahead and rank and combine options if desired. We're going to discuss how these options meet our interests, and we're going to go ahead and record our results. And so I will say, like, as a former high school teacher, I think that this is probably when we did this in person, that was one of the more exciting opportunities to be at the whiteboard and to showcase your wonderful teacher penmanship. So I think I will probably miss being able to do that since we will be in kind of a virtual setting. But that was usually the time when, you know, people got to really highlight how great they were at writing on a whiteboard. Next slide, please.
So I think
after we've gone through.
Go right ahead, please. Yeah, sorry.
After we've gone through and we've evaluated our options, we're going to go through and we have, if we've agreed upon this ahead of time as part of our like our communication norms, we have our system for identifying what meets the interest with a plus mark. If it doesn't meet the interest, maybe it doesn't apply at all, maybe we're not sure. But then we are able to notate close to the option what the team feels about it in terms of further evaluating whether or not it's something that makes it to the final step. Next slide, please.
This is slide 50, is that right?
Yes,
right,
that's
so
50.
Mine. Thank you. I can't count. So, all right, we're on the home stretch now, just so you'll know. So formulating solutions, then we need to aim for the best possible agreement, building on the most highly rated options. So the options that we've all rated together as one team, not as two teams, but as one team, those are the ones that we're going to build on. And then we can offer friendly or yesable amendments as we go. And the key word there is friendly amendments. That, you know, how can we enhance what we've already come up with as a highly rated option, if at all possible? And then we need to circle back to interest and data as needed. You know, are these really meeting our interest? And are there any additional data that we do not have, or are there some new data that we have not seen yet that we just became aware of that should be brought to everyone's attention so that we can apply it to the task? And then we need to test for consensus. And the consensus is that is something that everyone can live with, that it's something good. Next slide, please. So reaching consensus, accept versus agree. All right, no one gives in, no one gets everything they want. No, not everyone always to compromise. It's the best possible solution for us at this time. So we're looking at what can we actually get to that is the best possible outcome for us at this particular point in time. And of course, that may vary from year to year or time to time. So in this particular negotiation round, it might be X 3 years from now. It might be entirely different from now, or it might be X +1, but it's going to be the best one that we can reach at this point in time. Next slide, please. Then you test for consensus. So has everyone been heard? Has everyone had a chance to say their piece? Have we all been treated respectfully, and we've listened to and now reached an understanding of that perspective that each one of us has? Can everyone live with and actively support the solution? Because we need to all live with it and actively support it. There can't be anyone hiding underneath the surface that I'm not, in other words, no saboteurs, right? No saboteurs waiting to sabotage the thing because they didn't really agree with it, although it appeared like they had during the negotiation process. So, and then are we in agreement? That's where we want to get to. Next slide, please. So dissenters have an obligation. If you cannot support a solution, then you need to explain why. And then you have to provide an alternative solution by building on or modifying the rejected proposal. So you just can't say it's no good, it stinks. Then what would be good? How would you fix it? If you have a problem, tell me what the solution is. It's very easy to point fingers and assign blame. It's not quite as easy to find a solution to that thing that you say isn't good. So what would be the solution? That's the obligation of any dissenter. Next slide, please. So I believe you understand my point of view, and that I understand yours. That's consensus. Whether or not I prefer the decision, I support it because it was reached fairly and openly and is the best solution for us at this time. That's the key. We reached it fairly and openly, and it's the best thing we could do right now, and therefore I can support it. That's consensus. It may not be ideal, may not be exactly what I want, but it's something that I can actually get behind. Next slide, please. So then we need to have a debrief with the parting thoughts, any final questions or comments. We need to ask the question, have we missed anything? Is there anything that needs to be improved? And if so, how we do that? We need to thank everyone for participating because it's going to be a lot of work. And there will be, I think, a lot of emotional currency expended on both sides and getting to a point that's a very good point, someplace better than we are right now. And that's the hope. Someplace better than we are today, maybe not to a perfect place, but someplace a little bit better than where we've been. Next slide, please. I think that's it, right?
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
that's the last one.
Yeah, that's the last one. So any other questions that anyone might have?
Just a brief question. What do you do when you've reached a sense of agreeing to disagree?
Well, then that may be something you're not going to be able to, that's something you'll walk away from this time and say, that's one of those things we're just not going to be able to deal with this time. So we may leave it the way it was and not change it. So, or it's also possible that we could still, even in interest-based bargaining, we could still reach impasse on certain things. And if that happens, then we have an obligation, both parties have an obligation to go through the impasse process. And then have, and the good news is with interest-based bargaining, we also will have a mediator. So if there's some really tough issues, we get to do the mediation right up front and hopefully don't go to impasse, that we'll get through that thing with the help of a mediator. And I don't remember the person's name right now, but we do have someone lined up. Do you remember, Andrea, the person's name?
I don't remember her name.
I don't either. I know what she looks like because we met with her. She's the one who did our training. So, and she will be available whenever we need her. So first, I see a couple of hands up. First, Trustee Gonzalez, Ewing, and then Dr. Jackson, please.
In this section of the presentation, there was a part where we talk about defining issues, or and what's confusing to me in the process is how we move from contract provisions, which are very specific, to more global interests and problems. So for example, enrollment caps, cutoff dates, class size, productivity levels, those are things that we negotiate at a very specific granular level. Those obviously impact overarching enrollment goals. This issue, the whole issue of interest-based bargaining came up. I hope I'm not going to violate closed session. Well, let me just say, the issue of enrollment management is one that concerns everybody in the district. It impacts our fiscal health. It impacts our ability to serve students. It also impacts working conditions, et cetera, and then gets negotiated in that granular way. When we get to contract negotiations, is it appropriate to say, look, we have an interest in solving this fiscal cliff issue. We're going to need to bring our enrollment to X level, or we're going to get hammered. And if we get hammered in that way, we're going to need to do some kind of dramatic changes in the structure of the district that are going to impact contract. So the broad issue is enrollment management and fiscal management. To what extent do various contract provisions touch on those, and how do we start over from a win-win, ideological or, positional structure, rather than I'm going to protect mine, you're going to protect yours. And I didn't quite see how that got introduced into the process. Can somebody help explain how you move from, specific contract provisions to the more global health of the district kinds of issues? And you could say that whether that was on healthcare or enrollment management or fiscal management or any number of things.
Yeah, so let me see if I can do that. So I'll use the example you used, enrollment management. I think one of the key interests will be that, and we're certainly going to bring it up, a key interest is that we need to increase enrollment. I think everyone will agree with that, for all those reasons you just articulated, that we're going to need to do that. Then, so to drill it down granularly, so what do we have, what's in the contract that currently supports that, right? Which fosters the improvement in enrollment, and what does not, and what could be in the contract that would. And it's not all, it may not just all be about class caps. It also may be about reaching understanding or agreement on certain other things. So for instance, for modality, for instance, whether we have hybrid classes, those types of things, the high flex stuff, those things get to be very granular. So that's how you do it. You look, first of all, what's the contract currently say? What we've articulated our interest. We've now, in the next step, once we've articulated the interest, we need to get to a problem question. What's the problem? The problem is that our enrollment is decreasing, not increasing. right? Then we brainstorm about that problem. We get to, what are the possible solutions to that? What could we do, right? That we believe could actually be done to alleviate that. And those are the things that are articulated granularly in the contract.
So when we normally sunshine a provision, we say, we want to open this provision within the contract. But before you can sunshine it, you need to have identified it as something that you were going to negotiate over, but you can't negotiate over it until you sunshine it. And so at what point do you bring the global issue to the table so that you can then identify the particular provisions within the contract, which then you must publicly sunshine? Here, let me just give you a very specific example of something that I think would be helpful. Chancellor, at Chabot, you had a very different way of doing enrollment management. You had a whole team that had faculty and staff as an integral part of it. Everybody consensed on what the schedule was going to be based on shared inputs, et cetera. That's very different than a lot of other districts where basically the vice chancellor says, here are the number of sections you get to offer, in what areas, go at it, but I'm the boss and you can tell me if you don't like it, but basically I'm going to make the decision. Those are two very different ways of approaching enrollment management. I believe at Chabot, Las Positas, that's part of the contract. Here, I think that would be a revolutionary and positive development, but I don't know, how does that kind of thing ever get sunshine or negotiated within this, what stage do we begin to reimagine the entire contract and say, here, look, this isn't working for us. We need to just redo this. This whole thing around enrollment management isn't working. How do we openly talk about that from an administrative point of view and from a labor point of view in a way that we're really having a real conversation and not digging in with positions in advance? Yeah, do you all understand what I'm trying to get to here?
Yeah.
Not be
exactly.
boxed in.
No, we're not boxed in. I think we have to sunshine articles and there's stuff about enrollment in their class caps, that kind of stuff. We sunshine that, and that allows us to open up that exact, what are our interests here? And our interests are in, let's create a new, we need a new enrollment management approach. That's the interest. And that's how we started. But that's done within the context of the negotiation itself.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Dr. J.
Yeah, I agree with what Trustee Ewan said. It's very different in different districts, and a lot of it has to do with the institutional climate of that particular district. And sometimes it even just depends on the person who's in the seat as either the lead negotiator for the bargaining unit and who's the lead negotiator for the district and who is the CEO. All of those things, when there's trust, I think sometimes you have a better chance of looking outside the box because people are not looking askance as to, I think as Andrea said, what is in it for me, because even though they put it under the IBB process, it still is that positional, I win, you lose. So I'm glad we went through the training, and I want to thank both Andrea and Ron for, I think even though it was a little intense at times, it was still a very good presentation. My question has to do with the sunshining, and I tried to go back and look and find the actual slide where you mentioned it, but your comment, I believe, Andrea, you were presenting that, and you said you may have 7 items that you want to sunshine, but you make it where you really only wanted 3, but you made it so broad that the other people feel like, oh, well, we won because, they had 7 things, but we really only came to consensus on 3, if I'm not misrepresenting what you said. So my question is, for this process to work, I believe that there has to be that degree of trust and also the honesty that these are some of the things, and they're not thrown out there, kind of as lost leaders, or to say, we want to put this on the table, but when we really don't want to put it on the table, but we're saying that so that the 3 items or the 4 items that are of concern, we can focus on and just say, put that off. Was that what I heard you say? Or if you could explain or elaborate on that, I would appreciate it.
Sure. So I think that was in response to Trustee Withrow asking about kind of it's more of the tactic of straight positional bargaining, where you walk in with like, here are my package positions. I need these 7 things, when you really have come up with 7 because there's 3 that you want, and you're just trying to essentially provide some other ones so that the other party thinks when they knock the other 4 out that they won something by not giving you all 7. So,
you were talking, okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, positional bargaining, and how you kind of walk in with, these are the package positions, we have 7, what are you willing to give us? Versus when you're in the IBB process, where it's, here are the issues that we agreed upon that we're discussing. Okay. What are everyone's interests underlying those?
Okay.
And so you're not showing up with these kind of packaged positions, believing that if you have, 7, then you can absolutely get 3.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
It's more of a traditional kind of negotiation tactic.
Okay. All right. I understand now. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Very good presentation.
Thank you.
Presentation.
Any other questions?
Thank you for that. And Nikki has one, but
that's the fact that we're not going back to the same. But
I'm happy to defer because I had a question already. So if anybody else has, I'm happy to.
Nikki, just to let you know at the time, it's 3:56.
Yeah.
So to ask your question, that's totally fine. But let's wrap this up because we need to go to closed session.
So going back to data and information, is it our position then as the administration that we will always share financial data? There have been times where the administration has not been quite so forthcoming about sharing, not this administration, right, you go through, sorry, Chancellor, don't mean to cast aspersions on anybody in particular, but there have been times where sometimes it's not clear that everybody's operating on the same page. You'll have, you'll hear from one of the bargaining units, look, I'm hearing this is what the budget is and this is what we can afford. And then you might hear from somebody else, no, that's not true. We can't afford that because, and it was always like, well, wait a second, this is just a math question. Does 2 + 2 = 4 or not? Yeah. Are there $4 in the budget or not? And sometimes we haven't been good about sharing toys. So I'm hearing that it is our position that we're always going to share the best information that we have, especially in regard to financial projections, so that we're all on the same page. That is correct, yes?
Yes, that is correct. And I'm not a good poker player, as you can see. As Andrea said, some people wear their emotions on their sleeves. I'm one of them. So what you see is what you get. And we've already established at our initial meeting with the administrative team items that we needed. And one of them was the budget. And we will share that information. There are sometimes things that, even though you share the budget, people will say, well, how come we have this? And I will say those are contingency because we have things that come up. So that is not in play. This is what we have in play right now. That is a contingency item. And in fact, we're going through right now a budget resource allocation model change that I'll be sharing a bit with you. And it's getting through our participatory governance process, but I do want to bring it to the attention of the board so that you're not on the very end and we send it to you and it's a fait accompli versus having some interaction before we get to that part. And so we are not looking at going into using that budget allocation model is what we're calling it right now. We're looking at maybe changing the wording of that to a resource model instead of allocation model, because I want us to have a full-blown look at that. And that is one of the reasons, as you mentioned with Chabot Las Positas, that openness of sharing the data, sharing the books, looking at it, looking at real numbers, and, you know, just really having an honest dialogue about it and not coming with perceptions or we're going to get this or get that. And I don't know of any district, and I'll say this and I'll be quiet because I know we have closed session coming up, but in that particular district, prior to my arrival, so it wasn't because I was there, the bargaining unit, because they were in a budget crisis, gave up step and columns. I don't know of any bargaining unit in the state that voluntarily said, we are not going to take our regular step and column because we know it's in the best interest of all of us, all of our faculty, and because we trust that the administration, when the funds are available, will look forward to renegotiating that in some respect. I was on the last end of that, of the renegotiation, but it was the first time that we hadn't gone to impasse in a long time. So it's possible. It is absolutely possible when you look at interest-based, if everybody goes into it with that in mind, rather than using the moniker, but really not following through with all the tenets of an interest-based bargaining process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. And again, thank you, Dr. McKinley, and thank you, Andrea, for this very informative session. So we're going to adjourn that portion, but are there any public comments for closed session, Madam Board Clerk?
No, ma'am, I do not see anybody as an attendee.
Fantastic. Bye, you all. And we will return at 6 o'clock for open session for the rest of the perfunctory board meeting. Okay, see you soon. Thank you.